Now let's take a look at ambient occlusion. Now this is something I use almost daily in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to put a cube in the scene, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to make it editable by hitting C on the keyboard. Get my polygon tool. I'm going to select 1, 2 faces and hit delete on the keyboard. So I'll get this little box. I'm going to move it up. Then I'm going to put a sphere in the scene. Pull it up a little bit. Maybe twist it over here a little. Go back down. Going to take the sphere and make it editable by hitting C on the keyboard. I come get my polygon tool again. With the sphere selected, I'm going to Control A or Command A on a Mac to select all the polygons. Then I'm going to right click, select Extrude. You want to uncheck Preserve Groups and do something like that. So now, if I render the scene, it looks like that. However, if I come to the render settings and I click on Effect and choose Ambient Occlusion, render this again now, and you'll see we get a very, very different result. So basically what's happening here is ambient occlusion is looking at all the points on the geometry in the scene, and it's sending out minimum and maximum ray lengths and shadowing the areas based on how far away other points are, or vertex points to be specific. In order for you to get how big a difference that is, let me just render this to the picture viewer. And then let me turn off ambient occlusion and render that again. So this is without, that's with. Without, with. Huge difference. Let's turn it back on. Come over here. So the color option allows you to define the color gradient that ambient occlusion is going to assign. So most of the time you're going to want to keep that from black to white. The minimum ray length is going to determine how the gradient defined in color will be rendered between exposed and non-exposed areas. So the closer that minimum is to maximum, the further the gradient will be pushed towards the edges, which are defined by the maximum ray length. So let's just move them around a little bit and see what we get. No big difference there. Let's take this back to 0. This back to 100. Now let's take this to 10 and see what we get. Okay, so that's a pretty big difference. So you're seeing that big difference in the maximum ray length. That's going to have a lot more bearing than the minimum will. Now the accuracy is how accurate the ambient occlusion solution will be. So at 50%, we have this. And actually, let's take our maximum ray length back to 100. Let's do that again. Let's take our accuracy to 100%. Okay, so this was at 50%. No real perceivable difference there. Now we have minimum and maximum samples. So the minimum is just a minimum threshold. This is really not that important. The maximum makes a huge difference. So let's just take a look at the last one we've got, and then let's take this up to, let's say, 256. It's going to definitely increase our render time. Let's go ahead and see what that does. There we go. Let's just get in here so we can see this better. And let's go to the last one. Okay, so here are the last two. Let's get in a little closer. And I'm not seeing much of a difference in this particular model. Let's go ahead and turn our contrast up to, say, 10%. And let's give this another render. Let's first do this at, say, 32. And we'll do another one at 256. Again, it's taking a little longer to calculate because of those maximum samples. Pretty clean solution. Let's go back and look at our one here. Now you can definitely see a difference in the 32 on the maximum samples and the 256. So the 32 is much noisier and the 256 is very clean and smooth. And again, depending on your model, the size, the scale, all of that's going to be taken into consideration for these numbers. So just keep that in mind. So the use sky environment, if you're using a sky object, it's going to take that into account when doing the calculations for ambient occlusion. The evaluate transparency has to do with if any of your models might have transparency built into the shaders, and it has to do with how it evaluates the transparency, whether it takes it into account or not. Okay, in our self-shadowing, if we turn self-shadowing on, then it's only going to calculate the ambient occlusion on the object. So we're not going to have the ambient occlusion calculated down here. So let's render that. And you can see that it didn't do the calculations on the floor here, but it did do the ambient occlusion here on the object itself. So you can see the last one we did and this one. So that's a quick look at ambient occlusion here in Cinema 4D.